So this will be part three, where I finish the essay by Alf Hornborg titled Animism, Fetishism, and Objectivism. I got a little cold outside, so I came down to my room. So just 2 pages left, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about this article. Perhaps some of these problems can be alleviated by recognizing the difference between drawing boundaries in an analytical and an ontological sense. We can probably all agree with Latour that nature is continually being intertwined with culture or society in our landscapes, our bodies, and our new hybrid technologies that obviously invalidate ontological versions of the Cartesian dichotomy. But does this mean that the categories of nature and culture, or nature and society, are obsolete and should be discarded? On the contrary, never has it been more imperative to maintain an analytical distinction between the symbolic and the pre-symbolic, while acknowledging their complex interfusion in the real world. Only by keeping society and nature analytically apart can we hope to progress in the demystification of that hybrid web in which we are all suspended, and which more than anything else obstructs our pursuit of relatedness, the realm of animated objects we call technology. We more than ever need to retain our capacity to distinguish between those aspects of technology that derive from nature and those aspects that derive from society. The laws of thermodynamics and the political economy of oil prices require completely different analytical tools. I am thus able to conclude by returning to that favorite topic of mine, machine fetishism. For a number of years now, I have been struggling with the intuition that there is something mysterious about technology, something that strangely seems to escape us, both as social scientists and as citizens. On the one hand, modern technology seems quite obviously to be a strategy for capacitating an affluent minority of the world's population through an asymmetrical exchange, and expanding net appropriation of resources from the rest of the world. On the other hand, technology tends to be represented as a politically innocent and intrinsically productive union of human inventiveness and the pure material essence of nature. Indeed, as a gift of the wealthier, developed nations to the rest of the world. How are these two contradictory images of technology able to coexist without the former contaminating the latter? The answer, Latour would undoubtedly say, lies again in that rigid categorical distinction between nature and society, between the world of pure objects and the world of human relations. Once classified as object, technology is automatically immune to political critique. For how could pure objects be conceived as sources of malign agency? If the behavior of the early 19th century Luddites today strikes us as odd, it is because they were not yet quite modern. Today we supposedly know better than to direct our political frustrations at machines. The efficacy of technology, we hold, comes from objective properties intrinsic to the nature of things. Like economic rationality and scientific truth, says Latour, technological efficiency forever escapes the tyranny of social interest. But if these modernist convictions were indeed to collapse, as Latour predicts, and we should realize the extent to which our technologies are in fact politically constituted, our machines, our machines would cease to be pure objects and conceivably be accredited with a malicious agency far surpassing that of any pre-modern fetishes. For to expose the agency of these cornucopian productive forces as a transmutation and deflection of the agency of other humans would be to render morally suspect that which modernity has couched in the descriptive neutrality of the merely technical. And in seeing for the first time the machines as they really are, as machinations, perhaps the animist within us would stir again, and we would ask ourselves, what manner of creatures are these things, part mineral, part mind, that serve the few to enslave the many? while fouling the land, the water, and the air. Such a scenario serves to remind us that animism and relatedness bring possibilities not only of harmony and community, but also of horror and rage. It might help us understand how the Cartesian suppression of relatedness has served a fundamental ideological purpose in the emergence and expansion of industrial capitalism. Against this background, nothing could be more revolutionary than to try to rekindle some of our pre-modern attitudes as we confront the demons of our own making. Um, so again, the title of this essay by Alf Hornborg is Animism, Fetishism, and Objectivism as Strategies for Knowing the World. And it's really a sample of what he discusses in his book, The Power of the Machine, which I believe was published in 2001. And his criticism of technology is, basically, if I can sum it up, that we in the industrialized West, in the developed world, look at an automobile, for example, and decontextualize it. We forget that it requires oil in order to run, and so we treat it as a sort of we project a sort of magical quality onto it by forgetting what has to happen in order for the vehicle to run on oil, right? We assume that it's a modern convenience that only helps us, and more and more we're recognizing what happens after the oil is combusted and it turns into CO2, which adds to the greenhouse effect and encourages further climate change, which is perhaps the biggest crisis humanity has and will ever face. But we forget what it takes to get this oil. Whether we're getting it from South America or from the Middle East, we're going to war to secure it. We're exploiting the natural resources, the ecologies within which non-developed and non-Western peoples are living in order to secure this oil which allows these machines to run. And the logic that Hornborg explains for us is the way that the industrial centers of the developed world systematically extract the resources of labor, human labor, and of the natural world from the periphery, and also sort of externalize and export the pollution of the industrial process, so that industry doesn't really take place in the developed West anymore. We've outsourced all of that, so that the third world, the global South, and Asia deal with the pollution of the industrial process, while we merely consume the products. And so we take for granted that the technologies that we consume are clean and almost magical in their ability to make life more convenient, when really what we've done is outsource the inconvenience required, and in fact the exploitation required to make these technologies possible. And I'm as guilty of it as anyone else. My computer was manufactured in a factory in China that employs 400,000 people in basically sweatshop conditions. And it's quite a paradox the way that, for example, in the Occupy movement, we're using these technologies that are only made possible by this capitalist system of global exchange and exploitation in order to critique that very same system. So capitalism is providing the means with which to dismantle capitalism itself. This is sort of how the dialectical process of history works, I would argue. So, consider Hornborg's work, consider Bruno Latour's work. His book, We Have Never Been Modern, is really important to read. Now, these aren't postmodernists, as it should have been clear after Hornborg's critique of postmodernism. These aren't relativists. These are thinkers who were trying to get beyond modernism altogether, be it modernism proper, or postmodernity as a reaction to modernism. They want a new way of thinking that realizes the way that subject and object co-constitute one another, the way that the subject is always participating in the object, and vice versa. There's no consciousness without a world, and no world without consciousness. And Hornborg talks about, relationalism, relationality. I usually talk about participation in the sort of participatory paradigm, but I think these are deeply related ideas, both equally revolutionary in their and radical in their critique and constructive offering for where our civilization should be headed if we hope to survive, um, you know, the next century. Clearly, there are those who will say that science is what will save humanity. And part of what Bruno Latour and others like him are pointing out is that science has always been tied into political and economic, um, networks of influence, and there has never been any pure science. Science has always had economic or political ends, and we have to recognize this. That when we criticize the political or economic ends of science, we aren't rejecting the scientific worldview and the idea that we should try to know things as they are rather than things as we wish them to be. So, food for thought. Let me know how it tastes.